Through decades of mathematical calculations and experimental observations, I discovered something remarkable: human reason, when applied with complete honesty, inevitably encounters its own limitations. While working on probability theory in my Paris laboratory, I began to notice that the same logical principles governing mathematical certainty could be applied to analyze the grand experiment of secular humanism. The results were startling. Every attempt to construct meaning, morality, and purpose from purely human foundations encounters the same mathematical impossibility: infinity divided by zero. Secular humanism, despite its noble intentions, contains internal contradictions that make its failure not just probable, but mathematically inevitable. Today, I'll demonstrate how the same rigorous analysis that solved problems in geometry reveals why human reason alone cannot bear the weight of human existence, and why this failure points directly toward the necessity of divine grace. Chapter 1: The Mathematical Impossibility of Self-Grounded Meaning. When I first developed the principles of probability theory with Fermat, we discovered that every meaningful calculation requires a fixed reference point, an absolute against which relative values can be measured. This same principle applies to human meaning-making with devastating precision. Secular humanism attempts to generate infinite meaning from finite human experience, which is mathematically equivalent to creating something from nothing. Consider the fundamental equation of humanistic meaning: if humans are the source of their own value, then human worth equals human declaration of worth. This creates an immediate logical paradox. The value creator and the value recipient are identical, making the entire system circular and therefore meaningless. It's like attempting to lift yourself by pulling on your own bootstraps, physically impossible because you lack an external fulcrum. I observed this contradiction repeatedly in my interactions with the freethinkers of my era. They proclaimed human dignity while simultaneously reducing humans to mere matter in motion. They celebrated human reason while denying any transcendent foundation for logical principles themselves. They demanded justice while claiming that moral categories were human inventions. Each position undermined its own foundation through internal contradiction. The mathematical precision of this failure becomes clear when we apply probability analysis. If humans are products of random material processes, what is the probability that their cognitive faculties accurately perceive reality? The answer approaches zero. Yet secular humanism depends entirely on the reliability of human reason to construct its entire worldview. This creates what we might call the rational bootstrap paradox, using reason to validate reason while denying reason any transcendent ground. Through experimental observation of humanistic societies, I predicted they would eventually consume themselves through these internal contradictions. Without absolute foundations, they would experience progressive moral relativism, nihilistic despair, and finally collapse into either tyranny or chaos. The mathematical certainty of this progression stems from the impossibility of infinite regress in logical foundations. Chapter 2: The Anthropological Contradiction: Humans as Simultaneously Everything and Nothing. My studies in both mathematics and human nature revealed a fascinating paradox that secular humanism cannot resolve. Humans simultaneously represent the highest possible value, as meaning creators, and the lowest possible value, as meaningless material arrangements. This contradiction generates what I term existential oscillation, the constant movement between grandiose self-assertion and nihilistic despair that characterizes secular societies. When I calculated atmospheric pressure, I discovered that nature abhors a vacuum. Similarly, human consciousness abhors meaninglessness. Yet secular humanism creates a spiritual vacuum by denying transcendent purpose while demanding that humans somehow fill this infinite void through their own finite efforts. The psychological pressure this creates is mathematically predictable and spiritually catastrophic. Consider the logical progression. If humans evolved through blind material processes, they possess no inherent dignity or purpose. But secular humanism requires humans to be dignified and purposeful to justify its entire moral and political program. This forces humanists into constant self-contradiction, simultaneously affirming and denying human worth depending on argumentative convenience. I observed this pattern in my correspondence with skeptics who alternated between celebrating human reason as the measure of all things and dismissing human beliefs as products of evolutionary accident. They could never maintain logical consistency because their worldview contains mutually exclusive propositions. Humans cannot be both the source of absolute meaning and meaningless products of chance without generating cognitive dissonance severe enough to fracture entire civilizations. The experimental evidence from humanistic societies confirms my theoretical predictions. They consistently experience what we might call value inflation, constantly expanding claims about human rights and dignity while simultaneously eroding the metaphysical foundations that could support such claims. This creates unsustainable intellectual debt that eventually forces systemic collapse. The mathematical impossibility becomes clear when we consider the infinite regress problem. If human value derives from human declaration, what gives humans the authority to make such declarations? And what gives them the authority to grant themselves that authority? The series continues infinitely, never reaching solid ground. Chapter 3: The Moral Calculation Problem: Why Secular Ethics Always Collapse into Relativism. During my work on geometric proofs, I learned that valid demonstrations require axioms that cannot themselves be proven within the system; they must be accepted as given. This principle applies with devastating force to moral reasoning. Secular humanism attempts to derive absolute moral obligations from relative human preferences, which violates the fundamental logic of mathematical proof. The calculation is straightforward: if moral principles emerge from human consensus or evolutionary advantage, they possess no binding force beyond social convenience. Yet secular humanists consistently demand that their moral conclusions be universally binding, that human rights, equality, and justice represent absolute truths rather than arbitrary preferences. This logical inconsistency creates what I call the moral authority paradox. I've observed that secular moralists inevitably appeal to transcendent categories while denying transcendent reality. They speak of human dignity as if it were mathematically certain while maintaining that humans are accidents of material process. They demand justice as if it were geometrically necessary while insisting that moral categories are human constructions. The contradiction generates unstable oscillation between absolute moral claims and complete moral relativism. Consider the probability calculation. If morality derives from evolutionary advantage, what is the likelihood that evolved moral intuitions track objective truth rather than survival benefit? The answer approaches zero, since evolution selects for reproductive success, not truth recognition. Yet secular humanism depends entirely on moral intuitions being reliable guides to objective moral reality. This creates another impossible bootstrap paradox. My experimental observations in political and social contexts confirm these theoretical predictions. Secular societies consistently experience moral drift, beginning with high ideals but progressively abandoning transcendent foundations until moral categories lose all meaning. The progression follows mathematical precision: absolute claims, relative foundations, logical contradiction, practical collapse, nihilistic despair, authoritarian reconstruction. The fundamental error lies in attempting infinite moral obligation from finite human authority. This violates the principle of proportionality that governs all valid mathematical reasoning. You cannot extract more from a system than you put into it, and secular humanism attempts to extract infinite moral authority from finite human declaration. Chapter 4: The Epistemological Crisis: How Human Reason Undermines Its Own Authority. My investigations into the foundations of mathematical knowledge revealed that even our most certain reasoning depends on principles that cannot be proven within pure reason itself. The axioms of geometry, the principle of non-contradiction, the reliability of sense experience, all require what we might call pre-rational commitments. This discovery has profound implications for secular humanism's confidence in autonomous human reason. When I applied rigorous logical analysis to the knowledge claims of secular humanism, I discovered systematic self-undermining. If human cognitive faculties evolved for survival advantage rather than truth detection, we have no rational basis for trusting our rational faculties. This creates what philosophers would later call the evolutionary argument against naturalism, the position that naturalistic evolution makes knowledge impossible. The mathematical precision of this problem becomes clear through probability analysis. Consider the likelihood that cognitive faculties shaped by blind evolutionary pressures would reliably track truth about abstract metaphysical questions. The probability approaches zero, since true beliefs about reality often conflict with survival-advantageous beliefs. Yet secular humanism stakes everything on the reliability of human reason operating independently of divine illumination. I observed this epistemological crisis playing out in the scientific communities of my era. The most rigorous mathematical thinkers, Newton, Leibniz, Descartes, recognized that their scientific work depended on metaphysical assumptions about divine rationality undergirding natural law. They understood that without God's mathematical mind as the foundation of natural order, human mathematical reasoning loses its connection to reality. Secular humanism attempts to maintain scientific confidence while rejecting the theological foundations that make science possible. This creates cognitive dissonance that generates either naive scientism, treating science as religion, or postmodern skepticism, rejecting the possibility of objective knowledge. Both responses confirm my prediction that secular reason, cut from its divine source, eventually destroys itself. The experimental evidence from secular educational institutions demonstrates this pattern clearly. They begin by celebrating human reason, but progressively abandon confidence in objective truth as the logical implications of their naturalistic assumptions become clear. The progression follows predictable mathematical sequence: confidence, doubt, skepticism, relativism, nihilism. Chapter 5: The Existential Mathematics: Why Finite Beings Cannot Generate Infinite Meaning. Through my work on infinitesimal calculus, I learned to think precisely about relationships between finite and infinite quantities. This mathematical training revealed the fundamental existential problem with secular humanism. It attempts to generate infinite meaning, purpose, and significance from finite human existence. The mathematics of this endeavor demonstrates its impossibility with geometric precision. Consider the existential equation secular humanism proposes: finite human life plus human declaration equals infinite meaning and purpose. This violates the basic mathematical principle that outputs cannot exceed inputs. You cannot generate infinity from finitude through mere addition of human will or declaration. The operation is mathematically invalid and existentially catastrophic. I predicted that secular societies would experience progressive meaninglessness despite increasingly desperate attempts to create purpose through human effort alone. The pattern follows mathematical necessity: initial enthusiasm, growing doubt, existential anxiety, nihilistic despair, frantic meaning-making, eventual collapse. Each cycle becomes more extreme as the fundamental impossibility becomes more apparent. My experimental observations in both personal experience and social analysis confirm these theoretical predictions. Individuals and societies that attempt to ground ultimate meaning in finite human existence inevitably experience what we might call existential inflation, constantly expanding claims about human significance while the foundation for such claims erodes. This creates unsustainable psychological pressure. The probability calculations are decisive. If humans are temporary arrangements of matter in an ultimately purposeless universe, what is the likelihood that their sense of meaning and purpose tracks objective reality? The answer is zero, since there is no objective meaning to track. Yet secular humanism requires humans to experience genuine meaning while denying the transcendent foundation that could make such meaning possible. The mathematical impossibility becomes clear when we consider the infinite regress problem in existential terms. If human life derives meaning from human goals, what gives human goals their meaning? And what gives the source of goal meaning its meaning? The series continues infinitely without reaching any absolute foundation. This creates existential vertigo that secular philosophies cannot resolve through rational argument alone. The experimental evidence from secular literature, art, and philosophy demonstrates this progression with remarkable consistency. Beginning with humanistic confidence, secular culture progressively confronts the implications of its own assumptions and descends into nihilistic despair or frantic attempts at meaning creation that become increasingly desperate and arbitrary. Chapter 6: The Political Calculation: How Democratic Ideals Require Transcendent Foundations. My analysis of decision theory and probability revealed that political systems, like mathematical proofs, require foundational axioms that cannot be derived from within the system itself. This insight has profound implications for secular humanism's political aspirations. Democratic equality, human rights, and individual dignity cannot be mathematically derived from naturalistic assumptions about human origins and nature. The political equation secular humanism proposes is logically invalid. Material evolutionary process plus human declaration equals absolute human rights and dignity. This attempts to derive absolute conclusions from relative premises, which violates fundamental logical principles. Yet secular democratic theory depends entirely on the validity of this impossible derivation. I predicted that secular democratic societies would experience progressive internal contradiction as they attempted to maintain absolute moral and political commitments while rejecting the transcendent foundations that could support such commitments. The mathematical precision of this failure becomes clear through logical analysis of democratic presuppositions. Consider the foundational democratic claim that all humans possess equal dignity and rights. If humans are products of random evolutionary processes, possessing varying capabilities and survival value, what is the mathematical basis for equality? Natural selection produces inequality, not equality. Yet democratic theory requires absolute equality as its foundational principle. My experimental observations in political contexts confirm these theoretical predictions. Secular democratic movements consistently appeal to transcendent moral categories while denying transcendent reality. They demand justice as if it were mathematically certain while maintaining that moral categories are human constructions subject to revision. This creates logical instability that generates progressive political chaos. The probability analysis is devastating. If political principles derive from human consensus rather than transcendent truth, they possess no authority beyond social convenience. This means that democratic values can be overturned whenever social consensus shifts, making democracy itself impossible to defend on secular grounds. The system consumes its own foundation through logical consistency. The fundamental error lies in attempting to ground infinite political obligation in finite human authority. This violates the mathematical principle of proportionality and creates unsustainable intellectual debt. Democratic societies that reject transcendent foundations inevitably experience either relativistic collapse or authoritarian reconstruction as they attempt to resolve the logical contradictions in their foundational assumptions. Chapter 7: The Experimental Evidence: How History Confirms Pascal's Mathematical Predictions. My scientific training taught me that valid theories must generate testable predictions that can be verified through observation and experiment. Applying this methodology to my analysis of secular humanism, I made specific predictions about the trajectory of societies that attempt to ground meaning, morality, and politics in autonomous human reason alone. The historical evidence provides overwhelming confirmation of these mathematical projections. The experimental data from secular societies demonstrates remarkable consistency with my theoretical calculations. Beginning with confidence in human reason and dignity, they progressively experience the logical contradictions inherent in their foundational assumptions. The pattern follows mathematical precision: initial optimism, growing doubt, internal contradiction, social fragmentation, nihilistic despair, authoritarian reconstruction, or civilizational collapse. Consider the probability calculations regarding secular educational institutions. I predicted they would begin by celebrating human reason but progressively abandon confidence in objective truth as the implications of naturalistic assumptions became clear. The experimental evidence confirms this prediction with startling accuracy. Secular universities now openly reject the possibility of objective knowledge, treating all truth claims as expressions of power rather than discoveries of reality. My analysis of secular moral philosophy generated similar predictions that have been confirmed through historical observation. I calculated that secular ethics would oscillate between absolute moral claims and complete relativism, never achieving stable foundation. Contemporary secular societies demonstrate this pattern precisely, simultaneously demanding universal human rights while denying any transcendent ground for moral obligation. The experimental evidence from secular political movements confirms my predictions about democratic instability. Without transcendent foundations for human dignity and equality, secular democracies experience progressive fragmentation as competing groups advance irreconcilable truth claims. The mathematical impossibility of grounding absolute political principles in relative human consensus generates predictable social chaos. Most significantly, my predictions about existential consequences have been confirmed through observable psychological and cultural data. Secular societies consistently experience rising rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, and nihilistic despair despite material prosperity. This confirms the mathematical calculation that finite beings cannot generate infinite meaning through autonomous effort alone. The cumulative experimental evidence demonstrates that secular humanism fails not due to external persecution or unfortunate circumstances, but through internal logical contradictions that make failure mathematically inevitable. This provides powerful confirmatory evidence for the necessity of transcendent foundations for human meaning, morality, and political order. Conclusion. Through rigorous mathematical analysis applied to the foundational assumptions of secular humanism, we have demonstrated that its failure was not merely probable but logically inevitable. The same precision that governs geometric proofs reveals that autonomous human reason cannot bear the infinite weight of meaning, morality, and purpose that human existence requires. This is not a limitation to be lamented but a mathematical demonstration pointing toward transcendent reality. The failure of secular humanism does not represent the bankruptcy of human reason but rather its proper recognition of its own boundaries and its need for divine illumination. True intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the greatest questions of human existence, meaning, morality, purpose, demand foundations that exceed finite human authority. The experimental evidence from history confirms what mathematical analysis predicted: societies that attempt to ground infinite aspirations in finite human foundations inevitably experience logical contradiction and practical collapse. This failure, precisely because it is mathematically necessary rather than accidental, provides powerful evidence for the God who alone can provide the transcendent foundations that human existence requires. The choice before us is not between reason and faith, but between reason that acknowledges its divine source and reason that destroys itself through impossible autonomous pretensions.